Imagine walking into a hospital, trusting the people wearing white coats with your life, only to discover years later that you were never a patient at all. You were the experiment. Not because you volunteered, not because you understood the risks, but because someone believed your life was worth less than the knowledge they hoped to gain. For decades, governments, doctors, and scientists insisted they were serving humanity. Yet hidden behind laboratory doors and official reports were decisions that would forever change how the world viewed medicine, ethics, and the value of human life. Tonight, we uncover one of history's cruelest human experiments, a story so disturbing that it transformed international law and forced the world to ask a haunting question. How far should science ever be allowed to go? If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind history, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and join us as we uncover the mysteries that shaped our world. History often celebrates discovery, the invention of vaccines, the conquest of deadly diseases, the first successful surgeries. Medical breakthroughs have saved millions of lives, extending human life expectancy farther than any previous generation could have imagined. Behind every advance stands the image of dedicated researchers working tirelessly to relieve suffering. But history has another side, a darker side. One written not with celebration, but with silence. Every scientific breakthrough carries a story. Some are inspiring, others are cautionary tales. And a few reveal what happens when ambition, fear, and prejudice overwhelm compassion. This is one of those stories. It begins during the turbulent decades of the 20th century, when medicine was advancing at an extraordinary pace. New technologies transformed hospitals. Microscopes revealed invisible worlds. Antibiotics promised to defeat infections that had terrorized humanity for centuries. Science seemed unstoppable. Governments invested heavily in research. Universities competed to make groundbreaking discoveries. Physicians became respected public figures whose opinions carried enormous authority. To many people, doctors represented hope itself. Questioning them was almost unthinkable. That trust became one of the most powerful tools ever exploited. The 20th century was also an age of war. 2 world wars reshaped entire continents. Nations raced to develop stronger armies, more effective medicines, and better methods of protecting their populations. Scientific competition became inseparable from political competition. In that environment, ethical boundaries often became blurred. Officials argued that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary decisions. If one painful experiment today could save thousands tomorrow, was it justified? If information gained from a handful of unwilling subjects might protect an entire nation, should morality stand in the way? These questions were no longer philosophical debates. They became government policy. Throughout Europe, Asia, and North America, different institutions quietly conducted research. That would never have been accepted under normal circumstances. Many experiments remained classified for decades. Others were disguised beneath scientific language so technical that ordinary citizens never realized what had happened. Victims often had no idea they had become part of a study. Some believed they were receiving treatment. Others believed they were helping doctors improve public health. Many never discovered the truth during their lifetimes. Among the darkest chapters of this history emerged during the years surrounding the Second World War. Under the banner of military necessity and racial ideology, Prisoners, civilians, and marginalized communities were subjected to brutal experiments that ignored every principle of medical care. The horrors uncovered after the war stunned the world. At the subsequent trials, evidence revealed prisoners deliberately infected with diseases, exposed to freezing temperatures, deprived of oxygen, and forced to endure procedures that had little regard for survival. The goal was often to gather data for military use or to support dangerous ideological beliefs. These crimes became some of the clearest examples of medicine stripped of its humanity. The international outrage that followed led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, one of the first major ethical frameworks stating that voluntary, informed consent is essential in human research. For many observers, the lesson seemed obvious. Surely such abuses could never happen again. Yet history would reveal a far more unsettling truth. The greatest danger was not always found in dictatorships or wartime laboratories. Sometimes it existed in ordinary clinics. Sometimes it wore a friendly smile. Sometimes it asked patients to trust the system. One of the most disturbing examples unfolded not behind barbed wire, but in a small American town where generations of families believed they were receiving medical care. The year was 1932. The United States was trapped in the Great Depression. Jobs disappeared overnight. Farms failed. Banks collapsed. Across the country, millions struggled simply to survive. In rural communities, healthcare remained painfully limited. Many families could not afford to see a physician. Preventable diseases spread easily through poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Among these illnesses, one stood out: syphilis. Before the discovery of penicillin as an effective treatment, syphilis was one of the most feared infectious diseases in the world. Left untreated, it could silently damage the brain, heart, nerves, and other organs over many years. Doctors desperately wanted to understand how the disease progressed. Researchers believed that carefully observing infected patients over long periods could answer questions medicine had never resolved. Those scientific goals, by themselves, were not unusual. The methods chosen to pursue them would become infamous. In Macon County, Alabama, hundreds of African American sharecroppers were recruited into what they believed was a healthcare program. Most had little formal education. Many had never received consistent medical treatment. Government representatives offered free examinations, transportation, meals, even burial insurance. To families living in desperate poverty, the offer seemed like an extraordinary act of kindness. Participants were told they suffered from bad blood, a vague local expression that referred to a variety of illnesses. They were never given enough information to understand what researchers actually intended to study. Instead of providing proper treatment, investigators carefully documented the natural progression of untreated syphilis over decades. Year after year, men returned believing they were receiving medical care. Instead, they became subjects in one of the longest and most controversial medical studies in American history. The most disturbing chapter had not yet arrived. During the 1940s, a remarkable discovery transformed medicine forever. Penicillin, the antibiotic, rapidly proved capable of curing syphilis when administered appropriately. Across the United States, public health campaigns encouraged treatment. Hospitals embraced the new drug. Military recruits received testing and medication. Medical experts increasingly recognized penicillin as the standard of care. At that moment, the study could have ended. Researchers could have informed participants of the truth. They could have offered treatment and acknowledged the scientific value already obtained. Instead, many participants were deliberately prevented from accessing the very medicine capable of curing them. Records later revealed efforts to ensure that some men did not receive treatment through outside programs, preserving the integrity of the study while allowing the disease to continue its course. What had begun as an observational study had crossed into something far darker. It was no longer simply about gathering knowledge. It had become a decision to prioritize research over human lives. For decades, wives became infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. Families buried fathers who never understood why their health continued to decline despite years of supposed medical supervision. The greatest tragedy was not only the disease itself, it was the betrayal. The victims trusted the very institutions responsible for protecting them, and those institutions chose silence. Decades passed. Researchers published papers. Medical conferences discussed findings. The study became accepted inside professional circles, while the participants remained unaware of what history was quietly recording in their names. Outside the research community, almost no one questioned what was happening. The experiment continued, hidden in plain sight. Few could imagine that the greatest challenge to the study would not come from senior scientists or government officials, but from a single voice unwilling to remain silent. That voice would soon force an entire nation to confront one of the darkest ethical failures in modern medical history. The man who would eventually expose the truth was not a famous politician, a celebrated physician, or a powerful journalist. He was an investigator named Peter Buxton, a young public health employee whose job required him to review research practices within the U.S. Public Health Service. At first, the Tuskegee study appeared to him as little more than another medical project buried in government paperwork. The official language was clinical, detached, and filled with technical terminology. On paper, everything looked orderly. But as Buxton dug deeper, the words began to reveal something profoundly unsettling. The participants had never given informed consent. Many did not even know they had syphilis. Even after penicillin became the accepted cure, researchers continued observing them instead of treating them. The more Buxton learned, the more impossible it became to dismiss. He repeatedly questioned senior officials. How could this still be happening? Surely someone had overlooked an important detail. Perhaps treatment had eventually been offered. Perhaps the documents were incomplete. Instead, he encountered resistance. The study, he was told, still had scientific value. Ending it now would waste decades of collected data. Those responses disturbed him more than the documents themselves. Somewhere along the way, preserving research had become more important than preserving lives. Buxton continued raising objections through official channels, believing that if enough people understood the situation, someone would intervene. Instead, his concerns were largely ignored. Years passed. The study continued. Hundreds of men grew older while unknowingly carrying a disease that modern medicine already knew how to cure. This moment reveals one of history's most uncomfortable truths. Institutions rarely collapse because every individual within them is malicious. More often, ordinary people become accustomed to extraordinary wrongdoing. One person assumes someone else has asked the difficult questions. Another assumes respected authorities must know best. Responsibility slowly dissolves until no one feels personally accountable. Meanwhile, the victims continue to suffer. By the late 1960s, America itself was changing. The civil rights movement had exposed long-standing racial inequalities. Television carried images of protests into millions of homes.
Public trust in government was beginning to erode under the weight of political scandals and the growing controversy surrounding the Vietnam War. Questions that had once been dismissed were now being asked more openly. People demanded transparency. They demanded accountability. Buxton realized internal complaints would never be enough. If the study was to end, the public had to know. In 1972, he shared the story with reporter Jean Heller of the Associated Press. When the investigation was published, the reaction was immediate. Headlines spread across newspapers nationwide. Americans were stunned. Many simply refused to believe it. How could their own government have knowingly withheld treatment from vulnerable citizens for decades? How could doctors, people sworn to heal, allow preventable suffering to continue? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Television broadcasts amplified the outrage. Editorials condemned the study. Medical professionals expressed disbelief. Civil rights leaders described the revelations as another devastating example of systemic racial injustice. The story quickly became international news. For decades, the experiment had remained hidden behind government files and scientific journals. Now it stood exposed before the world. The backlash was overwhelming. Within months, the study was finally terminated, but ending the research could never undo 40 years of damage. Many participants had already died. Others suffered irreversible complications, affecting their hearts, nervous systems, and brains. Some had unknowingly infected their wives. Children had been born with congenital syphilis, a condition that could have been prevented entirely with timely treatment. Behind every statistic stood a family, a wife who trusted the doctors, a son who never understood why his father slowly lost his health. A granddaughter whose life began with a disease that should never have reached her. Historical tragedies often become lists of numbers, but numbers cannot capture betrayal. The deepest wound left by the Tuskegee study was not merely physical, it was psychological. For generations, trust in the medical system within many African American communities suffered profound damage. Even decades later, researchers and healthcare providers found lingering skepticism toward government-sponsored medical programs. Some families remembered stories passed down by parents and grandparents, stories warning them not to trust official promises. Trust, once broken, is painfully difficult to restore. The consequences extended far beyond one study. Medical schools began examining how research ethics had failed so completely. Universities revised their training. Hospitals strengthened oversight. Congress launched investigations into human experimentation. The scandal forced an uncomfortable realization. Ethical violations were not confined to dictatorships or wartime enemies. They could occur inside democratic societies that considered themselves leaders in science and human rights. That realization changed medicine forever. The response eventually reshaped international standards governing human research. Institutional review boards, known today simply as IRBs, became mandatory for research involving human participants. Scientists would now face independent ethical review before studies could begin. Participants had to understand the risks. Consent had to be voluntary. Researchers became responsible not only for scientific results, but also for protecting every individual involved. These principles seem obvious today, yet they were written in response to painful lessons purchased at an enormous human cost. History often advances through triumph. Sometimes it advances through failure. This was one of those failures. Yet Tuskegee was not the only chapter forcing humanity to reconsider the limits of scientific ambition. Around the same period, other troubling revelations emerged. Documents uncovered secret radiation experiments conducted during the Cold War. Some hospital patients had unknowingly been exposed to radioactive substances. Military personnel participated in tests without fully understanding potential risks. Communities near nuclear facilities questioned whether they had been adequately informed about environmental dangers. Each case differed in its details. Some were motivated by national security, others by scientific curiosity. Still others by bureaucratic indifference. But they shared a disturbing pattern. The people assuming the greatest risks often possessed the least power: prisoners, minorities, the poor, hospital patients, children. Groups with limited ability to refuse. Again and again, history revealed the same uncomfortable equation. When ethical safeguards weaken, vulnerable people tend to bear the consequences. Science itself was never the enemy. The microscope does not possess morality, neither does the laboratory. Knowledge is neither compassionate nor cruel. Human choices determine whether discovery serves life or sacrifices it. That distinction matters. Because medical research has also produced extraordinary achievements, vaccines have eradicated deadly diseases. Organ transplantation has given thousands a second chance at life. Cancer treatments continue extending survival for millions. Countless volunteers have participated in ethical clinical trials that transformed medicine while fully understanding the risks. These successes remind us that scientific progress and human dignity are not opposing goals. They depend upon each other. A discovery built upon deception eventually damages both science and society. A discovery built upon transparency strengthens trust for generations. This lesson became increasingly important as medicine entered the age of genetics, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. The questions changed. The ethical responsibility did not. Today, researchers can edit genes, analyze entire genomes, develop therapies once considered impossible. The power available to modern science would have seemed miraculous to physicians only a century ago. But every new breakthrough carries an ancient question. Just because something can be done, should it be? Could history have taken a different path? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Tuskegee study is this: researchers believed they were collecting knowledge for the future. Instead, the study became one of history's most powerful warnings about the misuse of scientific authority. Its lasting contribution was not the medical data it produced, it was the ethical revolution it forced upon the world. And yet, even after Tuskegee ended, another haunting question remained. If such a tragedy could continue for 40 years without public awareness, how many other forgotten stories still lie hidden inside government archives, sealed court records, and abandoned laboratories, waiting for someone willing to uncover them?
History has a way of reducing human lives to footnotes. A government file records a participant by number instead of by name. A medical journal summarizes decades of suffering in a few detached paragraphs. A statistical report speaks of mortality rates and clinical outcomes while revealing almost nothing about the people behind those numbers. Yet every page of the Tuskegee study represented a real person. A farmer who woke before sunrise to work fields that barely provided enough food for his family. A husband who trusted the government physician because he had been taught that doctors existed to heal. A father who hoped the free medical care would allow him to remain healthy enough to provide for his children. Their lives unfolded quietly while the study continued around them. Some participants noticed their health slowly deteriorating. At first, the symptoms seemed ordinary: persistent fatigue, joint pain, headaches, moments of confusion. As years passed, those symptoms became increasingly severe. Untreated syphilis often attacks the cardiovascular system, damaging the heart and blood vessels. In other cases, it reaches the nervous system, leading to paralysis, blindness, dementia, or psychiatric illness. For many families, the changes were heartbreaking. The man who had once been strong enough to plow fields from dawn until dusk struggled to complete simple tasks. Memory faded. Pain became constant. Some experienced personality changes so dramatic that loved ones scarcely recognized them. The disease was progressing exactly as the researchers intended to observe. Every decline became another entry in the records. Every worsening symptom added another data point. But for the families, these were not observations. They were tragedies unfolding in slow motion. The betrayal became even more profound because the participants believed they were receiving professional medical attention. Routine examinations continued. Blood samples were collected. Physical checkups were performed. Medical terminology filled official forms. To an outside observer, it looked like healthcare. But appearances concealed a devastating truth. The examinations existed primarily to document suffering, not to prevent it. One of the most painful episodes involved a diagnostic procedure known as a spinal tap. Researchers described it to participants using reassuring language, implying it was part of their treatment. In reality, the procedure was intended to gather additional scientific information. Many of the men endured fear and discomfort, believing it would improve their health. Instead, it advanced the objectives of the study. This distinction matters because informed consent is not simply obtaining agreement. True consent requires understanding. A patient cannot make a meaningful choice if the purpose of a procedure is intentionally concealed. That principle now lies at the heart of modern medical ethics, but during the Tuskegee study, that principle was repeatedly ignored. As the years passed, the world outside Macon County transformed dramatically. The Second World War ended. The United Nations was established. New technologies reshaped daily life. Television entered American homes. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and discrimination across the nation. Humans walked on the moon. Medicine entered an era of astonishing progress, yet the study quietly continued. Its participants aged alongside history itself. Some had joined as young men. They became grandfathers before the experiment finally ended. Entire generations grew up without realizing they were living beside one of the greatest ethical scandals in American medical history. The secrecy surrounding the study was remarkable. Scientific papers discussing its findings appeared in respected medical journals. Conferences referenced its observations. Researchers debated technical details. Few publicly questioned whether the research itself should continue. This silence raises another uncomfortable question. How does wrongdoing become normalized? History suggests it rarely happens all at once. Instead, ethical boundaries shift gradually. A small compromise becomes acceptable because it appears temporary. Another decision follows. then another. Each individual step seems manageable. Only years later does society recognize how far it has drifted from its original principles. This pattern extends far beyond medicine. It appears in governments that slowly restrict freedoms, corporations that ignore warning signs, institutions that protect reputations instead of people. The Tuskegee study remains one of history's clearest demonstrations of what can happen when accountability disappears. The participants themselves rarely possess the power to challenge the system. Many lived in poverty. Educational opportunities had been limited by decades of racial inequality. Government officials and physicians occupied positions of immense authority. When those authorities assured participants that everything was being done for their benefit, there were few reasons to doubt them. Trust became the foundation upon which the study survived. Ironically, that same trust would become its greatest casualty. Even today, public health experts acknowledge that rebuilding confidence after ethical failures takes decades. Communities remember. Stories pass from parents to children. Experiences become family history. For some African American families, Tuskegee became more than a historical event. It became a warning. Researchers have spent years studying how this legacy affected participation in medical research and healthcare utilization. While many factors influence healthcare decisions, there is broad agreement that highly publicized ethical violations contributed to lasting distrust in some communities. The consequences reached beyond medicine. They challenged the relationship between citizens and public institutions themselves. If officials could conceal something this significant for 40 years, what else might remain hidden? Questions like these became increasingly common during the 1970s. It was an era marked by skepticism toward authority. Investigative journalism flourished. Government secrecy faced growing scrutiny. Citizens demanded transparency in ways previous generations rarely had. The Tuskegee revelations became part of a broader cultural awakening. People realized that institutions deserved respect only when they earned it. Trust required honesty. Accountability required independent oversight. Good intentions alone were no longer enough. One of the most significant outcomes was the publication of the Belmont Report in 1979. Rather than focusing solely on rules, the report articulated 3 enduring ethical principles that continue to guide human research today. The first was respect for persons. Every individual possesses autonomy and deserves truthful information before deciding whether to participate in research. The second was beneficence. Researchers must actively maximize potential benefits while minimizing harm. Scientific curiosity can never justify unnecessary suffering. The third was justice. The burdens and benefits of research should be distributed fairly. No community should be targeted simply because it lacks political power, economic influence, or social status. These principles now appear straightforward, yet history reminds us they were written because previous generations failed to uphold them. Ethics often advances one painful lesson at a time. Today, anyone volunteering for a clinical trial receives detailed explanations. Potential risks are discussed openly. Participants retain the right to withdraw. Independent ethics committees review research protocols. Documentation is carefully monitored. Investigators answer not only to scientific institutions, but also to legal and ethical standards developed through decades of hard-earned experience. No system is perfect. Mistakes still occur. Debates continue regarding emerging technologies such as gene editing, artificial intelligence in medicine, and large-scale health data collection. But the questions asked today are fundamentally different because history left behind unmistakable warnings. The voices of those once ignored now echo through every ethical review meeting, every informed consent document. Every discussion about balancing scientific progress with human dignity. Perhaps this is the most meaningful legacy of the Tuskegee study, not the data collected, not the papers published, but the reminder that every scientific breakthrough begins with a human being whose life possesses value far beyond any research outcome. When medicine forgets that truth, it risks losing the very purpose for which it exists. Healing is more than curing disease. It is preserving dignity, protecting trust, respecting choice. Without those foundations, even remarkable discoveries carry a heavy moral cost. As historians continue examining 20th century medicine, Tuskegee stands as a solemn reminder that the greatest failures are often not acts of ignorance. They are acts of knowing and choosing not to stop. Yet one final chapter remained before the nation could begin confronting its past. An apology would come, compensation would be offered, and the survivors, now elderly men who had lived with the consequences for decades, would finally hear words that had been absent for far too long. Those words could never restore the years that had been taken from them. But they would acknowledge a truth the world could no longer deny. For the men who survived, justice arrived painfully late. By the early 1970s, many of the original participants were elderly. Some had spent nearly their entire adult lives believing that government doctors had been protecting their health. Instead, they learned that they had been observed, documented, and studied, while ineffective treatment had existed for years. The revelation was almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine discovering that the people you trusted most had watched your illness progress, not because they could not help, but because they chose not to. For many survivors, the emotional wound cut even deeper than the physical disease. Some struggled to believe anything they were told afterward. Others wondered whether every appointment, every blood test, every reassuring smile had been part of a carefully maintained illusion. Families experienced their own heartbreak. Wives learned they had been exposed to a preventable disease. Children questioned why their fathers had grown sick despite receiving whatever one believed was professional medical care. Grandchildren began piecing together family histories that suddenly made devastating sense. The suffering had not ended with one generation, it had echoed across several. In 1973, the United States government agreed to a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the participants and their families. A financial settlement was reached, and surviving participants, along with certain family members, became eligible for medical benefits and other assistance. No amount of compensation, however, could restore lost health. No payment could erase decades of deception. Justice, in this case, could only acknowledge the harm. It could never reverse it. Even after the settlement, another question lingered. Would the government ever openly admit what had happened? For years, official responses focused largely on procedures, investigations, and policy changes. Those measures were necessary. But many believed something essential was still missing: an apology. not merely from individuals, but from the nation itself. That moment finally arrived on May 16, 1997. Inside the White House, several surviving participants gathered with their families. They were elderly now. Some walked slowly, some required assistance. Time had left its mark on each of them. Standing before them was the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. His words were carefully chosen. He acknowledged that what had happened was profoundly wrong. He stated that the United States government had failed its own citizens. He recognized that trust had been violated and that the nation carried responsibility for that failure. Perhaps the most meaningful part of the ceremony was not political. It was deeply human. For decades, these men had lived without hearing the truth from those who owed it to them. Now, at last, the country publicly recognized what they had endured. The apology did not erase history, but it ensured that history would no longer remain hidden. The White House ceremony represented more than the closing of one painful chapter. It symbolized a commitment to remember. Because forgetting is often the first step toward repeating mistakes, history repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. When societies distance themselves from uncomfortable truths, they become vulnerable to making similar decisions under different circumstances. The names change, the technologies evolve, the justifications become more sophisticated. Yet the underlying question remains remarkably constant. What happens when human beings become instruments instead of individuals? This question extends far beyond one experiment. It reaches into every era. During times of war, governments often argue that extraordinary dangers require extraordinary measures. During public health emergencies, difficult decisions must sometimes be made quickly. Emerging technologies create opportunities previous generations could scarcely imagine. Artificial intelligence can analyze millions of medical records. Genetic engineering offers possibilities once confined to science fiction. Advanced surveillance systems monitor disease outbreaks across entire populations. Each innovation carries remarkable promise. Each also requires extraordinary ethical responsibility. The lesson of Tuskegee is not that science should be feared. Quite the opposite. Science has saved countless lives. Vaccines have eliminated devastating diseases from entire regions. Modern surgery allows patients to survive injuries that would once have been fatal. Cancer treatments continue improving. Organ transplantation offers second chances. Medical research remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. But history insists upon one condition. Progress must never come at the expense of basic human dignity. The greatest scientific discoveries lose their meaning if they abandon the very people they are meant to serve. This is why modern ethics emphasizes informed consent, transparency, independent review, and respect for every participant. These principles are not bureaucratic obstacles. They are safeguards written in response to real human suffering. Each signature on a consent form represents lessons learned through painful experience. Each ethics committee exists because earlier generations discovered what can happen when oversight disappears. The story also challenges us in another way. It asks whether evil always appears obvious. Popular culture often portrays history's darkest moments as acts committed by unmistakable villains. Reality is rarely that simple. Many of the people involved in the Tuskegee study believed they were contributing to scientific knowledge. Some convinced themselves that the potential benefits justified the methods. Others simply continued following established procedures without questioning them. That does not excuse their decisions, but it reveals something profoundly unsettling. History's greatest ethical failures are often sustained not by monsters alone, but by ordinary people who stop asking difficult questions. That lesson belongs to every generation, because every generation inherits new technologies, new crises, new uncertainties, and new opportunities to choose either compassion or convenience. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate nearly a century after it began. It reminds us that trust is among civilization's most valuable resources. Patients trust physicians. Citizens trust public institutions. Communities trust researchers. Once broken, that trust requires years, sometimes generations, to rebuild. The survivors understood this better than anyone. Their lives became a permanent reminder that the relationship between science and society depends not only upon knowledge, but also upon integrity. Toward the end of their lives, some survivors chose to speak publicly. They participated in interviews, visited educational events, shared memories with students, historians, and healthcare professionals. Their voices transformed tragedy into education. Instead of allowing history to disappear into archives, they ensured future generations could learn directly from those who had lived it. Their courage changed the conversation. Medical students today often study Tuskegee not because of the scientific data produced, but because it demonstrates the catastrophic consequences of abandoning ethical principles. Future physicians learn that technical excellence alone is insufficient. Competence must be accompanied by honesty. Skill must be guided by compassion. Knowledge must remain accountable to humanity. As historians continue uncovering forgotten chapters of the past, the Tuskegee study occupies a unique place. It is not remembered because it advanced medicine. It is remembered because it transformed medical ethics. Its legacy lives not in laboratories, but in every patient who now receives honest information before agreeing to participate in research. In every ethics committee that carefully reviews new studies, in every researcher who pauses to ask not only, can we do this, but also, should we? That question may never have a permanent answer. Each generation must ask it again. Each generation must decide where the boundaries of science should remain. And each generation bears the responsibility of ensuring that no pursuit of knowledge ever diminishes the value of a single human life. Because history teaches us something both hopeful and sobering. Our greatest advances are not measured only by what we discover, they are measured by how we choose to discover it. The story of Tuskegee is painful. It is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront betrayal committed not in secret prisons or distant battlefields, but within trusted institutions. Yet confronting difficult history is not an act of pessimism, it is an act of responsibility. Only by acknowledging the darkest chapters of our past can we protect the future from repeating them. Perhaps that is the true purpose of remembering, not to remain trapped by yesterday, but to ensure tomorrow becomes more humane. If history has taught us anything, it is that progress without conscience is never true progress at all. Subscribe to Chronicle Nexus for more untold stories from history's darkest chapters, and share this documentary with someone who loves powerful historical stories. Because somewhere in the archives of history, another forgotten story is still waiting to be uncovered. Another mystery still challenges what we think we know, and another lesson from the past may one day shape the future. Until then, Remember that history is not merely a record of what happened, it is a mirror reflecting the choices humanity continues to make. Here at Chronicle Nexus, where history meets mystery.